Book 29 of 2020 was Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. So I became aware of Freire when I was studying my PGCE because one of my tutors had mentioned his work, and I'd cited him a lot in my essays that I'd been writing at the time. So he's quite well revered within educational literature. Essentially, he can be credited with the reimagining of the kind of student-teacher learning dynamic. So what there tends to be within education, or at least what there was in kind of Victorian times, and what there was up until very recently, was what Freire terms the banking model of education, which is where the teacher is like the authoritarian filler of students who are empty vessels. So you're almost kind of like filling them with knowledge, and they're kind of like passive beneficiaries of that. It kind of, I mean, empty vessels comes from Dickens' character Gradgrind, who, I think it's Hard Times, where it goes, facts, all they need is facts, which is, you know, it's based in Victorian times, written in Victorian times. So it's kind of that representation of education, which, you know, education began like that. So Freire suggests that this is actually quite oppressive, because what is happening is learners are inferiors to the teacher, and so therefore there's an oppressor and the oppressed. And what he suggests is that what there should be instead is a problem-solving way of teaching, which is where the student and the learner kind of co-create knowledge through dialogue and through communication. And so you kind of almost like construct meaning through that, which actually is probably more likely how we learn. You know, if you think about, if you ever learn a skill from somebody, it will be through communication and through dialogue. You don't just sit there passively and you know, you ask questions, and you kind of like, you could even suggest something instead of what is being taught you. You know, there's that kind of dialogue back and forth. You kind of almost are on, you know, if you're an adult and you're learning something, you're treated like an equal. Whereas it seems to be that when people are younger than the teacher, that the teacher oppresses them and kind of almost treats them as if they are inferior, which, I mean, intellectually they might be slightly lower, slightly inferior in that sense, in terms of the knowledge that is being taught, but they're not inferior in terms of their intellect. I mean, it's questionable, isn't it? I suppose this is why it's kind of an argument, but the idea is that you will learn a lot better if you have that communication and that dialogue, and that the teacher can also learn from the students. You know, there's been many times where I've been teaching and my students have asked me a question or have said something, and they've actually taught me something because I've considered what they've said. And so it has to be that kind of, you know, back and forth, rather than it just being that the teacher has all the answers, because they don't. Like, they obviously they know their information, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know everything. They couldn't possibly know everything. And so Freire kind of suggests that this kind of banking model of education means that you're almost kind of teaching people to blindly accept what's taught to them, so that they never kind of question anything, they never kind of challenge that status quo, and they almost kind of have like an unconscious fear of the freedom to challenge the status quo and to kind of understand like what's actually going on, because they're just accepting that everything that they're told is fact. And, you know, if you can't understand that you're oppressed, and you can't understand history and what's actually happening around you, then you can't shape the present. And this is kind of like what oppressors want. Oppressors want you to blindly accept everything that they tell you, so that you can't question kind of your current circumstances and what's happening in the present, because then you won't be oppressed anymore. So in order to kind of create individuals that will question and that will remember history and learn about history and have kind of some freedom over challenging the way things are done and conventions and things like that, you need to have this kind of problem-based education rather than the banking model. I mean, you've got to think about it really like the banking model. It does keep society suppressed. It does keep them orderly and, you know, following kind of government and things like that. There's a reason why, you know, why it is in educational system and why a lot of government policies kind of, you know, do a lot of testing and things like that, because it creates that kind of environment regardless of what types of teachers that you have. And I guess teaching is a profession as well that does attract quite a few people that like power and like to have that kind of, you know, oppression over people. You know, it's not really great to say that, but we've all had teachers that have done that, you know. What Freire also says is that everyone strives to be human, and that oppression interrupts that and actually creates dehumanisation. If you oppress another person, you dehumanise them, and through your oppression, you also become dehumanised. So we've got a society of individuals that are dehumanised, that are not behaving in a human way. I think what Freire is kind of suggesting is human in terms of like humanity. And so we're kind of almost like behaving like, you know, we're not human. Anytime that kind of like violence is used in, you know, any kind of oppression is violence. It doesn't have to be exact, you know, violence in terms of physical violence or sexual violence. Any kind of objectification, any kind of injustice or exploitation, it's all kind of working to oppress people and dehumanise them. Oppressors are often materialistic, and what they want is they want to suppress others so that they kind of own them, and therefore, you know, they have power over them, but in doing so they dehumanise themselves. So what oppressors tend to do is they will offer help to the oppressed. So for example, you know, welfare or like charity or whatever. But Freire says that that's actually falsely generous, because you can't help someone who's oppressed if you are still an oppressor. So although you're giving charity or whatever, you're still a beneficiary of oppression. So therefore you have to become oppressed yourself to join with the oppressed and therefore work towards liberation together. I suppose really from a critical kind of viewpoint, it's all very sociological, this, and it's all very well and good to say things like this, but how do you actually achieve this? How do you actually, if you are an oppressed, how do you become oppressed and then work towards liberated? It wasn't really kind of gone into in much detail to kind of understand that. It was kind of just, you know, kind of skated over, if you will. So that I would say that that's kind of a criticality of what Freire was explaining, but I can understand where he's kind of coming from. These are kind of very socialist viewpoints as well. So I mean, I imagine that if you're not socially like inclined towards socialism, that you might be a little bit more what's the word, where you're more of a barrier towards it, a little bit more of a, I can't remember the word, it'll come to me eventually, but then I imagine that that's because you're a conservative and therefore you are an oppressor. I mean, that would be the argument, because obviously, well, I'll get to that in a minute actually. So Freire also talks about, so this is actually leads on to what I was just saying. There's this inoculation by the oppressors of individuals with this bourgeoisie appetite for personal success, as if it's possible to achieve personal success when you're oppressed. Like, it's impossible within societal structures to get to the level of the privileged oppressors. Like, it's quite challenging to do that, and so therefore you can basically say to people, you can all be what you want and you can all get to whatever you want, but unless you've got money and unless you've got privilege, it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to get where you want to get because everything's against you. And so therefore, you know, you can't really, as a beneficiary of privilege, you can't really judge those that are less privileged than you and say that they're there for their own doing and you're where you are for your own doing, because in reality, if you're better than somebody else in terms of your like economic wealth or your kind of position within society, it's not because of your own success, it's because you're a beneficiary of an oppressive society. And so you kind of need to recognise that and understand your privilege in relation to other people. and it's not, you know, it's not just kind of your economic wealth either, it's kind of like generations of economic wealth. I'm reading at the minute a book called White Like Me, and he talks about it as well, how, you know, inherited wealth helps you a lot in terms of privilege, which, you know, people from certain sections of society don't have that privilege because they're the kind of generations derived from slaves. They don't have that economic wealth that's been passed down for generations and generations, you know, so they're constantly being kind of oppressed by society. So Freire kind of explains how often in politics people will act as kind of intermediaries between oligarchical elites and the people, and kind of have almost kind of like a populism way to their politics, but actually it's just oppressing, because once that politician becomes part of the oligarchy and government and whatever, they're no longer part of the people, and so they can't do things for the good of the people because they become the oppressors, and therefore you know, almost kind of like contribute towards the oppression. Freire also talks about how oppressors don't kind of recognise that them having more means that other people have less. You know, there's not kind of an abundance of things that go around. If you get more of something, somebody else is going to have less of it. Or at least this is, I guess, actually, that is a viewpoint. So to be critical of that, you could argue that that's quite a narrow view, because actually, is there a finite amount of resources? Is that actually the case? That might be something to kind of consider. But he also suggests that, you know, having a monopoly on things and having kind of more privilege, it dehumanises others because they don't have that privilege. You are taking away from those other people the ability to be a human being, because they cannot have what you've got because of your privilege. You know, they have to rely on welfare and things like that, which is dehumanising. And it's the society that's dehumanising them, because they can't get the, you know, quality education, they can't get the quality you know, environments to live in, they don't have, you know, well-paid jobs, and it's kind of like, you know, and they get, you know, unjustly affected by police and stuff like that. So, you know, because of like biases and whatever. So, you know, people don't seem to understand that if they are a beneficiary of privilege, they will naturally be supposedly better than the people that are below them, but they're below you because they're oppressed. You know, you need to kind of challenge that oppression. Freire also talks about how there's you know, manipulation through cultural invasion. So the oppressors always kind of say what is the culture, so what is the way that you know, what's the way to be that's best, so what's the right way of talking. So for example, if you speak in a received pronunciation way, you are deemed as being more cultured and better than someone who speaks with an accent, and you're viewed as being more intelligent and everything. There's lots of studies that support this. So this isn't just kind of a sociological assumption from Freire, this is actually, you know, psychologically backed up as well. And this kind of understanding of, you know, what is right behaviour and what's not right behaviour for you to benefit from the oppressive structures, you have to behave and conform to those, you know, selected culture in order to benefit from the system. You know, when I am interacting in a professional way, don't speak with this accent. Like, I try to be more kind of clear in the way that I speak, because I understand the impact that has. So, you know, I can pretend to be middle class very easily, but I'm not middle class. But I know that I will be more of a beneficiary from the oppressive system if I can behave like that. You know, unfortunately, some people can't pretend to be, for example, white, to benefit from an oppressive structure. So there are things that you can't do, that you can't, you know, identify with the oppressors in order to benefit from the system. So you're kind of stuck, really. And this leads as well to, you know, oppressed individuals are quite self-depreciating, and, you know, often people that are oppressed are told that they're good for nothing, that they're, you know, lazy, that they're unproductive, that they're dull dossers, and, you know, lots of people put their judgments onto oppressed individuals without recognising the oppression that they're under. You know, often people behave in particular ways because of societal structures and because of how they've been treated and because of, you know, everything that has happened to them. And therefore, what Freire is kind of advocating is that we try and humanise our interactions with other people so that we treat them as an equal rather than, you know, as an oppressor onto someone who's oppressed. Obviously, these are kind of, like I mentioned before, sociological representations of a society. They're very kind of Marxist and socialist, and so they could very easily be challenged by the other viewpoint. I thought they were very interesting to listen to. I kind of am quite socialist myself, so I'm kind of on this side anyway. It would be interesting to find out what a challenge to this is, what a challenge to Freire's kind of ideology is, because being in education, I would completely agree with his replacement of the banking model with a more problem-based you know, education through dialogue. I think that's actually more effective at getting people to truly understand things that are being taught them rather than just recalling facts. And so I think, you know, he's very kind of insightful in that way. I did find when I was listening to this book that it wasn't very kind of easy to sustain my attention because it's quite, it's like a conversation rather than like an academic kind of construction of an argument. And therefore it was quite, there's a lot of it that I would probably cut out and make more clear, but I recognised that it was written a long time ago, and it was from, you know, a guy who grew up in Brazil and was an exile and was, you know, in education there, and he kind of saw the different privilege within, you know, because obviously in Brazil, I mean, I learned about this when I was in kind of primary school, like, you know, you've got, or secondary school, I can't remember, you've got a really, really rich part of Brazil, and then you've got the kind of like, is it favelas, are they called? The slum part of Brazil, which they're almost like next door to each other, but they never mix and they never kind of, you know, interact with each other, and yet, you know, they're human beings, and yet they're treated so differently, and the people in the favelas are dehumanised completely. And so, yeah, I thought it was very, very interesting, and I think it's worthwhile listening to or reading, but it's not like amazing and you're going to really enjoy listening to it or whatever. I think it's more of a learning kind of book than a reading for enjoyment.